We slipped from the void of space into the orbit of Gamma 9, our target, a distant binary star system where scientists had detected the ancient ruins of a lost civilization. I, Dr. Brian Quinn, watched the system unfold before me with trepidation. The vast, decaying structure orbited lazily around the twin stars, half lit by their faint blue light. It was a station of some kind, colossal and intricate, hanging in the emptiness as if waiting to be rediscovered. "Dr. Quinn, are you seeing this?" Commander Spencer's voice came over the comms, pulling me from my thoughts. I nodded, though he couldn't see me, my gaze fixed on the ruins. "I am," I replied, scanning the alien architecture with an intensity that bordered on reverence. It was as grand as anything I'd ever seen, dwarfing our own ship in size. The structure appeared to be circular, like a vast wheel suspended in space, its walls adorned with twisting forms and symbols that no human eye had ever seen. Commander Spencer brought us in, docking our vessel against a weathered entrance. The ship's automated systems confirmed a stable airlock. One by one, we filed out into the chill of the ruins' corridors, our breathing echoing in the metallic silence. The corridor opened into a vast space, murals covering the walls, spanning up to the ceiling in swirls of alien symbols and distorted forms. I held my breath, tracing the lines with my eyes, entranced by the patterns that seemed both alien and strangely familiar. The murals depicted an immense figure, its arms stretched across the wall in an open-mouthed scream, or perhaps a howl. I touched the rough surface, trying to make sense of the symbols etched deeply into the walls. The alien language was complex and jagged, almost hostile in design. They seemed to emit a strange kind of energy, faint and disorienting. I felt a pull, a desire to understand these symbols, to decipher them. I pulled out my tablet, which had a language analysis program, and began running it over the symbols, piecing together fragments of meaning. A few words came through, just impressions at first. Eternal slumber, consumption, and sacrificial binds. This was a prison, I whispered, almost to myself, my voice swallowed by the silence. I could feel the weight of the place, an ancient purpose beneath the surface, dormant yet potent. "What was that, Dr. Quinn?" Dr. Audrey Monroe asked, looking over her shoulder. Her eyes were sharp, though there was a glint of unease in them. "These inscriptions," I said, gesturing to the walls. "They're talking about containment, about keeping something locked away." Commander Spencer frowned, crossing his arms. "Then why build all this grandeur? If they wanted something contained, they wouldn't make it the centerpiece of their architecture." I didn't have an answer for that. Part of me felt the same question chewing at my mind, like a riddle whose solution was hovering just out of reach. As we continued to explore, the silence began to weigh on us. The ruin was quiet, but not the kind of quiet you find in empty spaces. This was a smothering quiet, full of expectation, as though the walls themselves were listening. As we moved deeper, I caught myself pausing, listening to faint sounds, whispers on the edge of hearing. At first, I dismissed it. I'd heard of auditory illusions before, especially in settings as isolated and alien as this. But then I began to notice bizarre behavior among the crew. Commander Spencer, typically calm and collected, began muttering to himself. Small phrases, half coherent, barely above a whisper. The words seemed nonsensical, strange guttural sounds mixed with fragments of language I didn't recognize. I noticed him glaring at the murals, muttering phrases he couldn't possibly understand. Dr. Beckett, too, began behaving oddly. She stood transfixed before a mural, her eyes wide, tracing the lines of the alien figure's face with a trembling hand, murmuring words that sounded suspiciously reverent. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to stress, the overwhelming strangeness of the place. But then, even I started hearing things. Sounds too soft to make out, yet echoing in my mind like distant thoughts. When I turned, there was nothing. Only the murals, silent and immovable. the symbols glinting faintly in the dim light. That night, as we set up a temporary camp in one of the ruins' side chambers, I thought about speaking up, telling the others about the whispers. But what could I say? It felt foolish, like admitting to a childish fear. The tension was noticeable, and I didn't want to add to it. I decided to keep it to myself. I fell into a fitful sleep, and that was when I had the dream, the first of many. I was walking through a hall of mirrors, each one casting a different reflection of me. Some were laughing, others crying. Some were distorted, stretched tall, or compressed, making my features grotesque. But what stood out most were the eyes. In each reflection, my eyes seemed altered, almost empty, as if I was a puppet, a lifeless shell. In one of the mirrors, I saw myself as I am, just staring. But then my reflection smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that didn't reach my eyes. It raised a hand to the mirror, and I felt an urge to reach out, to touch the glass. My hand lifted, touching the reflective surface. And then, as though something were pressing against my mind, I heard a voice, faint and alien, whispering from within my own reflection. "Find me." I jolted awake, covered in a cold sweat. The camp around me was quiet, my team sleeping or lost in their own restless dreams. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. I found myself avoiding the others, spending more time with the murals, poring over the alien language. The words and symbols tugged at my thoughts, calling to me in a way I couldn't explain. When I studied them, the whispers became louder. They seemed to guide my hand, helping me understand words that should have been indecipherable. During one such session, I noticed Dr. Monroe watching me. "Brian, you've been at this for hours," she said, concern in her voice. "You need to rest." "I can't stop," I said, more sharply than I intended. "There's something here, something they're trying to tell us. If I can just understand." Dr. Monroe gave me a long, searching look. "Is it worth it?" she asked, softly. Her words lingered, and for a moment, I felt her concern cut through the haze. But I couldn't explain the pull, the urge that seemed to override reason itself. I turned back to the symbols. She lingered a moment longer before walking away, leaving me alone with the mural and the whispered thoughts that felt like my own. The erratic behavior among the crew intensified. Commander Spencer's bouts of muttering became more disturbing. Sometimes he'd go silent mid-sentence, his eyes unfocused, as if listening to someone who wasn't there. Dr. Beckett had started scratching symbols into her own notes, carvings that looked similar to the alien language on the walls. They hadn't learned the symbols as I had, but they seemed to know them nonetheless, tracing them with an obsessive, almost worshipful reverence. I knew I should say something, that this behavior was strange, but I felt an odd sense of acceptance, as though it was inevitable, as though I understood somehow that this was what the ruins did. I felt that my mind was brushing against something immense and terrifying, but even as fear twisted in my gut, I couldn't bring myself to leave the murals, to escape the ruins. It was Dr. Monroe who finally broke the silence, pulling me aside one day as the others were deep in their trance-like states. "Brian," she whispered, her face pale, eyes darting toward the others. I've been hearing things, voices, but not mine. They're calling me, Brian. They're calling all of us." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just me, she'd heard it too. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. I don't know what's happening, Audrey. But whatever this is, it isn't safe." She bit her lip, glancing at the murals around us, her gaze lingering on the ominous figures. "It's like they're in our heads," she whispered, "like they're waiting for us to let them in." The thought settled into my mind like a stone, its weight almost unbearable. We were being drawn in by something unseen. The murals weren't just carvings on the walls, they were conduits, channels that reached into our minds, implanting their own thoughts and desires. The idea was as absurd as it was terrifying, but in that moment, with Audrey's hand clutching my arm and the whispering in the walls getting louder, it felt all too real. Audrey, if you're hearing it too, my voice faltered, trailing into the thick silence. I wanted to rationalize, to convince myself this was just the strain of isolation, a psychological trick brought on by the vastness of the alien ruin. But the conviction in Audrey's eyes made that impossible. She nodded slowly, her eyes darting to the others. It's not just us, Brian. Spencer, Beckett, they're different. It's like something's taken root inside them. We'd finally decided we couldn't continue, that whatever answers lay in these ruins weren't worth the cost. Audrey and I moved quickly, our steps echoing in the vast corridors. Each turn we took seemed familiar, yet wrong, as if we were circling back to the same places again and again. "This way," Audrey whispered, her voice taut with barely controlled fear. She gestured down a dim passage, and I nodded, gripping my flashlight tightly, fighting the sensation that the walls were closer than before. But as we walked, the passage narrowed, twisting in on itself. I could feel a haze settling over my mind, dulling my senses. "Wait," I said, stopping. "We've been here before." Audrey glanced at me. "No, that's impossible. We went left, then right, but..." Her voice faded, the realization dawning in her eyes. Every corridor looked identical now, the same alien symbols stretching along the walls, each one twisting in a way that felt maddeningly wrong. The passages seemed to narrow, forcing us deeper into the ruin, away from any sense of exit. "We can't stay here," I said, fighting to keep the rising panic from my voice. But the more we walked, the more the corridors seemed to shift and warp around us, trapping us in an endless loop of stone and shadow. The whispers were curling through my mind, distorting Audrey's voice, turning it into something strange and unfamiliar. I tried to focus, to remember the layout we'd studied before entering, but the images slipped through my mind like water through my fingers. "Brian," Audrey's voice was a whisper, a haunted edge to her tone. "He doesn't want us to leave." And in that moment I knew she was right. The ruin was a shifting maze designed to keep us here forever. No matter which path we took, we found ourselves looping back, each hallway narrowing and closing in on us, as if the ruin itself were twisting our reality, pulling us deeper. After hours of wandering, we ended up back in the main chamber, staring at the mural that loomed over us like a silent witness. The figure depicted there, with its outstretched arms and hollow eyes, seemed almost to mock us, a reminder of the entity's hold. With no escape, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to study the symbols again. Slowly, I began piecing together the mural's grim narrative. The murals told of an ancient species, a race long gone, who once inhabited this ruin. They were a highly advanced civilization, yet bound by something much darker, a powerful entity worshipped as a god. It had granted them visions, insights, but at a terrible price. The creature had devoured their minds, consuming their consciousness piece by piece until nothing remained but husks. This god had promised them enlightenment, immortality even, in exchange for their devotion. The civilization was entranced, enslaved by the promises, willingly surrendering themselves to it until, in a final act of desperation, they realized the entity's true nature. This was no deity. It was a parasite, feeding on the essence of sentient life. They had tried to imprison it here, sealing it within these ruins, their efforts immortalized in the carvings. But the parasite was patient. It lay dormant, waiting for beings with minds eager to learn, souls ripe for possession. As I deciphered the last symbols, my breath caught. The final words in the mural seemed directed at us, a warning across the millennia. "It waits for you." A shudder coursed through me, the mural's message sinking deep into my psyche. The entity wasn't merely trapped, it was conscious, aware of our presence, using every ounce of influence it could muster to break free. The symbols seemed to writhe, as though reaching for me, for my mind. I staggered back, feeling the weight of the ruin. I understood then that we weren't simply explorers. We were pawns in an ancient trap, baited by knowledge and driven toward release. We had awakened something that should have been left buried. I began to notice just how insidious the parasite's influence had become. It crept into our thoughts, speaking in whispers that echoed from the depths of our minds. Audrey confided that she felt as though her own thoughts weren't hers alone, that something else was nesting within her psyche. And as I observed the others, it became clear that we were all slowly slipping from ourselves. Spencer, normally so steady, became increasingly erratic. I'd catch him in the middle of conversations that seemed to go nowhere, his voice low and strange, as if he was speaking to someone invisible. He started to question my intentions, his eyes narrowing whenever I approached. One evening, he pulled me aside, his face drawn, his voice a low, angry whisper. "I know what you're doing, Quinn," he said, his words laced with accusation. I frowned, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "You think I don't see? You're trying to bring it here, aren't you? You're working with it." He spat, his eyes wide with paranoia. "I won't let you take us down, Quinn. I won't let you doom us all." His words unsettled me deeply, but what disturbed me more was that I could see a sliver of his reasoning. Part of me felt that perhaps he wasn't wrong, that perhaps I was in some way helping this entity. I had pursued its secrets, been driven to learn its language, and even now, knowing the danger, I still felt its pull. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't solely my curiosity at work, that the ruin, and whatever lay within it, was feeding off my fascination, bending my will to suit its own ends. Dr. Beckett, too, became almost unrecognizable. She seemed to live in a state of trance, her fingers tracing symbols on every surface she could find, mumbling words in an alien dialect she shouldn't have known. She became fixated on a small artifact we'd discovered, a tablet etched with yet more of the alien language. She held it like a talisman, her eyes glazed, whispering secrets only she could hear. The crew's sanity was unraveling, and yet I couldn't bring myself to pull them from the ruin. The more I tried to resist, the more those parasitic thoughts wormed into my consciousness, blurring the lines between my own will and that of the entity. The rift in the team widened with each passing day. Shane Fletcher, our medic and psychologist, was supposed to be monitoring the crew's mental health, but he had become consumed by his own obsession. He'd spend hours pacing, muttering to himself, scratching strange symbols into his skin. When I confronted him, he merely looked at me with a hollow gaze and whispered, "It's telling me what I need to do, Brian. It's showing me the truth." I tried reasoning with him, telling him it was the entity's influence, that he needed to fight it, but he just laughed. "We're already part of it, Brian. Don't you see? It's in all of us. We're just pieces of something larger." Fear crept into me, not just for Shane, but for myself. The more I tried to convince him, the more his words resonated, planting seeds of doubt that took root in the corners of my mind. What if he was right? That night, we found Shane in the main chamber, standing before the mural, carving symbols into his skin with a shard of metal. His eyes were blank, his voice a soft chant, in a language I could almost, but not quite, understand. We managed to restrain him, but his actions left us all shaken, our already fragile sanity fraying. In a final act of desperation, I turned to Audrey, seeking an ally against the growing madness. But I could see the strain in her face, the bags under her eyes. She admitted that she too had begun to dream, strange visions that mirrored my own nightmares. She told me of walking through endless corridors, of feeling her will slipping away, replaced by a foreign presence. "We're losing them, Brian," she whispered, "and I don't know if we can stop it." The breaking point came when I realized the parasite wasn't just influencing the others. It was inside me too, manipulating my thoughts, steering me in ways I could barely comprehend. It began with small compulsions, a need to return to the murals, an urge to study the symbols late into the night, but it became more insidious, bleeding into my thoughts and distorting my sense of self. I started to lose time, blacking out and finding myself in places I didn't remember walking to. I'd wake up with symbols scrawled in my own handwriting, etched in ink on my notes. Worse still, I found myself completing phrases in the alien language, phrases I had no way of knowing. It dawned on me, slowly and painfully, that the parasite was no longer a distant threat. It was inside my mind, twisting my will, weaving its thoughts into my own. And as I fought to retain my autonomy, I felt it pushing back, exerting a subtle but unyielding force, like fingers wrapped around my consciousness. The realization filled me with a sick dread. I was no longer just an observer. I was becoming an extension of the parasite's will, my actions guided by something beyond my control. And the worst part was, the part that left me shaking in terror, was that I could feel my resistance weakening, my will slipping as the entity drew me deeper into its thrall. In a moment of clarity, I realized that if I didn't act soon, I would lose myself entirely. The parasite was patient, weaving its influence slowly and carefully, but I knew that eventually I would succumb, my mind twisted into a tool of its bidding. I needed to act. I needed to find a way to break free. Desperation took hold, urging me to a last frantic attempt to confront the entity's influence. I gathered what remained of my strength and sought out Audrey. Together, we pieced what fragments of the ancient language I could decipher, hoping they might hold the key to resisting the entity's power. "Maybe it's not fully contained," Audrey murmured as we pored over the symbols. "These ruins were meant to imprison it, but it's clear that whatever kept it locked away is weakening. If we can understand the symbols, maybe we'll find a way to reinforce them, or at least shield ourselves from its influence." Her words sparked a faint, desperate hope. Perhaps the ancient civilization had left behind these barriers as a last defense against the entity's reach, a psychic wall of sorts that kept it contained within its prison. But the parasite was clever. It had endured eons, learned to seep through the cracks, and now it was inching its way into our thoughts. If we could just decipher the alien symbols fully, maybe we could resist its pull, shield our minds and hold on to our willpower. But even as I clung to that hope, I felt the entity pressing deeper, its whispers twisting through my thoughts like barbed wire, tempting and taunting in equal measure. Doubt grew, a creeping suspicion that any action I took might feed its control rather than stop it. As we prepared to face the entity's influence head-on, a grim resolve settled within me. The parasite might be ancient, its grasp nearly unbreakable, but I would fight it with every last ounce of will. We prepared for what felt like a final confrontation. Audrey and I sat in silence, the remnants of our fractured team scattered and lost to the entity's influence. A dread like ice settled over me, and I could feel the parasite's whispers intensify, its voice coiling through my mind, a haunting lull that promised freedom and answers. If only I would give in. But I wouldn't. I clung to the last threads of my resolve as Audrey and I devised a plan, a desperate one. There was no longer any question of escape or survival. We had to find a way to weaken its grip on us. And if the ancient civilization had managed to imprison it here, then perhaps there was a chance, however slim, that we could at least defend ourselves against it. Spencer and Beckett were somewhere in the ruins, entirely lost to us now. Their behavior had become erratic, both of them speaking in cryptic phrases that sounded more like transmissions from a nightmare than human speech. They'd fallen fully under the parasite's control, and we both knew that if we encountered them now, they'd likely try to stop us. As we approached the central mural, the largest of them all, which depicted the ancient civilization's final, desperate attempt to contain the parasite, I felt a strange vibration beneath my feet. The entity was awake, aware of us, stretching its influence as it probed our minds. "Do you see it?" Audrey pointed to a sequence of symbols we hadn't noticed before, hidden in the intricacies of the mural's design. "It's a containment protocol. They use some kind of mechanism to bind it here." My heart raced as I took in the hidden symbols. They were etched so faintly that they seemed to blend into the stone itself, but they held an unmistakable power. It was like the language itself was a kind of psychic lock, a ward against the parasite's influence. "We could use this," I said, the words tumbling out. "If we destroy the other murals, we could disrupt its reach. These carvings, they're like conduits, amplifying its power. If we take them out, it might weaken the entity's hold over the station, over us." Audrey nodded, but her face was pale, her eyes shadowed by fear. She knew the risk as well as I did. Destroying the murals would mean moving deeper into the ruins, facing Spencer and Beckett if they tried to stop us, and all the while, the parasite would be fighting back, pushing its way into our minds, tempting us to give in. But there was no other choice. We had to try. As we began our task, hammering at the first mural, I felt a surge of resistance within my own mind. The parasite's whispers rose to a fever pitch, becoming less like words and more like an overwhelming presence, a pressure that filled my skull, muddying my senses. "You cannot win!" it hissed, the words slicing through my mind with a jagged edge. "You are mine, Brian. I have waited for you, prepared for this. You belong to me." I staggered, the hammer slipping from my grasp as I pressed my hands to my head, trying to block out the voice. Images filled my mind, visions of endless halls stretching forever, each one reflecting versions of myself that were no longer fully me. In these mirrored halls, I saw myself as the parasite would have me, hollow-eyed, broken, a servant to its will. I sank to my knees, barely aware of Audrey's panicked voice beside me. The parasite was showing me my future, a fate where I would become one of its many servants, my thoughts and will entirely subsumed by its hunger. The visions felt so real, so tangible that I could barely distinguish them from reality. I felt myself slipping, my resolve cracking, but Audrey's voice pulled me back. "Quinn, we have to keep going. You can't let it take you now." Her voice was desperate, a lifeline that cut through the fog in my mind. I clung to her words, letting her voice anchor me in the present. With great effort, I forced myself to my feet, gripping the hammer as I fought against the entity's pull. The hallucinations faded, but I could feel the parasite's influence lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for any moment of weakness. We moved from chamber to chamber, smashing the murals one by one, each impact loosening the parasite's hold just a little. But as we reached the third mural, we encountered Commander Spencer. He stood blocking the entrance to the chamber, his face twisted in an expression I didn't recognize, his eyes empty yet filled with a malevolent gleam. "You have to stop, Quinn," he said, his voice vacant, a mockery of the man he had once been. "You're disrupting the balance, don't you see? It's pointless to fight. The entity has chosen us, given us a purpose. Spencer, listen to yourself, it's manipulating you. This isn't who you are." But he only laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the chamber. "I'm more myself than I've ever been," he said. "I see the truth now. The parasite isn't our enemy, it's our salvation." Spencer rushed at me, his movements eerily swift. We struggled, his grip impossibly strong, his face twisted with fury. I could see the parasite in his eyes, a hollow gleam that had drained him, replacing his humanity with something alien. I fought back, but the entity's voice urged me to surrender, to let it take me as it had taken him. Spencer forced me down, his hands tightening around my throat, my vision blurring as darkness crept in. Desperately, I reached out, my fingers grazing the handle of the hammer that had fallen just out of reach. With the last of my strength, I grabbed it, swinging it up in a sharp arc and slamming it into the side of Spencer's head. He staggered back, his grip loosening just long enough for me to roll away, gasping for air. Spencer stumbled, the parasite's control over him wavering for a split second, but his face quickly twisted into a mask of rage. I scrambled to my feet, gripping the hammer tightly as Audrey pulled me back. We didn't wait to see if he'd recover. Together we ran, his furious shouts echoing behind us as we fled through the darkened corridors. We reached the final mural, but I knew time was running out. The parasite was losing control, its desperation intense. Yet its influence over me was stronger than ever, clouding my thoughts, twisting my will. Audrey looked at me, her gaze steady, though her eyes were filled with fear. "Do it, Quinn," she said. "This is our last chance." I raised the hammer, the entity's voice roaring in my mind, a cacophony of hatred and despair. "Stop! You cannot win! I am eternal!" With a final surge of strength, I brought the hammer down, shattering the mural into pieces. The final mural shattered under the hammer's blow, fragments scattering across the floor. I felt an immediate release, as if the room itself exhaled. The whispers in my mind receded to muffled murmurs, and I felt truly alone in my thoughts. I looked over at Audrey, her face filled with relief and exhaustion. The entity's hold on us had weakened, but the heavy silence told me it hadn't vanished completely. It was still here, still lurking in the shadows of the ruin, biding its time. Audrey touched my arm. "We need to get the others." I nodded. If we left now, maybe we could escape before the entity regained strength. But Spencer and the others, I couldn't abandon them. No matter how far gone they might be, they were still part of my team, and I couldn't leave them to face this place alone. Audrey and I moved through the darkened corridors, the air still thick with a lingering malevolence, though the parasite's influence was weaker now. I felt more in control, the whispers merely shadows on the edge of my mind. Still, I knew the danger wasn't over. We found Spencer first. He was lying against a wall, half-conscious, his eyes glazed but unfocused. Blood matted the side of his head where the hammer had struck him, but his breathing was steady. I knelt beside him, checking his pulse as Audrey held a light over us. "Spencer," I said softly, my voice steady. "Can you hear me?" He stirred, his gaze flickering to mine, confused but aware. His expression softened, as if seeing me for the first time in days. "Quinn?" he rasped, his voice weak. What happened?" Relief washed over me. Whatever influence the entity had exerted over him had faded, at least for now. He was lucid, though badly injured. "You're going to be all right," I told him. "We're getting out of here." He nodded, grimacing as I helped him to his feet. I could see he was struggling, his strength nearly gone, but he managed to lean on me as we continued down the corridor, searching for the rest of the team. We found Shane next, wandering near one of the smaller mural chambers, his expression dazed. He looked up as we approached, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Brian?" His voice was a ghost of its usual self, uncertain, like a man waking from a nightmare. Where am I?" "It's over," I assured him, stepping forward to steady him. "The entity's grip is weakened. We're leaving." He blinked, relief crossing his face. He seemed fragile, almost broken, his mind struggling to process what had happened. But he was with us, back to himself, and that was enough. I placed his arm over Audrey's shoulder, and together we began making our way back toward the entrance, the faint whispers following us, a reminder that the entity was still alive within the ruin. As we reached the last corridor leading to the exit, we found Dr. Beckett, standing at the edge of the light, her gaze fixed on a fragment of mural that hadn't been destroyed. Her fingers traced the symbols, her face serene, as though she were entranced by the very presence of the entity itself. "Beckett," I called softly, stepping toward her. "It's time to go." She didn't respond at first, her eyes focused on the alien carvings. But as I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, she blinked, as if waking from a deep sleep. She looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, her hands trembling. "Brian, it was inside my head," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I could feel it twisting my thoughts. I thought I'd never be free. "You're free now," I said gently, guiding her hand away from the mural. "We're leaving." She nodded, taking a deep breath as she pulled herself away from the wall. Her gaze lingered on the alien symbols one last time before she looked back at me, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet resolve. Together, the four of us made our way to the exit, each step pulling us further from the ruin's hold, each breath feeling lighter as the whispers faded behind us. As we boarded, I cast one final glance at the ruin. I knew that knowledge would always call, and eventually, someone else would come. All I could do was leave a record, a warning, hoping it would be enough. In the silence of the ship, we all sat in the common area, letting the gravity of our experience settle in. Spencer was lying on a cot, his injury stabilized, his breathing steady as Shane checked his vitals. Beckett sat across from Audrey and me, her face a mask of exhaustion, yet I could see a small spark of strength returning to her eyes. For a while, no one spoke. We were all processing, coming to terms with what we had encountered, with how close we had come to losing ourselves to the entity's influence. Finally, Audrey broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her gaze shifting to me. "We write a report," I said. "We tell them everything, warn them of the danger. The ruin needs to be left alone, buried in the stars forever." Shane nodded, his expression grim. "Do you think they'll listen?" I let out a long breath, the weight of the experience settling on my shoulders. "I don't know, but we have to try. If anyone ventures there, they might never make it back." We set the ship's coordinates to take us away from Gamma 9. The ruin had taken a toll on each of us, marking our minds in ways we might never fully recover from. But we had managed to escape. And in some small way, we had left the entity weakened, its reach curtailed within the ruin, at least for now. I watched the alien ruin recede in the distance, its silent halls and darkened chambers returning to the quiet isolation of space. The stars shone coldly around it, distant and indifferent, as if bearing silent witness to the horrors contained within. A faint smile crossed my lips as the ruin faded from sight. It was over. We were free. And as we drifted into the endless expanse of space, leaving Gamma 9 behind, I felt at peace, knowing we had escaped its grip, if only barely.